Can you all hear me? Are we on up the back there? Okay. Well, wow, what a crowd. Welcome. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm sure most of you do. If you haven't been here before, I'm Gary Perry. I'm Dean of the Charles E. Schmidt College of Science. And I'd like to welcome you all here to our spring series, the first lecture in our spring series, The Frontiers of Science. Just a little bit of news since you were last here. I think we had our last Frontiers lecture on March 19th. A lot has happened here at Florida Atlantic University. I think most importantly, we have a new president, Mary Jane Saunders, and probably many of you have followed that in the news over the last years. And Mary Jane is indeed a botanist, a scientist herself. So she's a kindred spirit with us in the College of Science. And she's actually appointed as Professor of Biological Sciences here in the Charles E. Schmidt College of Science. We've also, in the last year, I think we mentioned this last year, you're now sitting in the Charles E. Schmidt College of Medicine. Since you were last here, we have now an independent medical school at Florida Atlantic University, and next month we hope to hear positively about accreditation of the medical school. So that's a big issue, a big thing for the university, and is almost a transformative event that we now have our own medical school. We've also solidified our relationships with the Max Planck Institute that's up in Jupiter. Since last year, we now have a new program in integrative biology and neuroscience, a new graduate program with the Max Planck Institute, and they are beginning to set up their operations in some of our facilities up on the Jupiter campus. And in about a year and a half, in the summer of 2012, they will move into their own facilities up in Jupiter that is positioned right next to the Scripps Research Institute that is also on the Jupiter campus. Also, since our last meeting, our last lecture, there was a major catastrophic event that occurred in the Gulf. And of course, that is the topic of today's lecture, the BP oil Gulf, the spill of oil into the Gulf. And today we have some of FAU's experts on hand to talk about FAU science and how it's involved in the BP oil spill in the Gulf and the cleanup of that. And I can already hear my voice cracking, so I'm not going to say too much more. Like most of you, I'm probably down with this bug that's going around, and I'm on my second Zithromax pack. I don't know about you guys, but anyway. So today, to lead what is really a panel discussion between three of our scientists is Dr. Len Berry. Dr. Berry is Distinguished Professor of Geosciences. He's also the Director of the Florida Center for Environmental Sciences. And Len is actually FAU's representative on the state task force on the oil spill. We also have with us Dr. Dennis Hanisak, who is Research Professor at Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute. Dennis is also Director of the Center for Marine Ecosystems and Health there. His expertise includes marine biology and ecology. And our third speaker today is Dr. Tammy Frank, who's an Associate Research Professor at Harbor Branch. Her area of research is on zooplankton, ecology, visual ecology, and deep sea ecosystems.
Can I say, for those of you who came to hear Shirley Pomponi?
I was about to say. Yeah. So Dr. Pomponi, who actually is Executive Director of one of the Cooperative Institutes at Harbor Branch, is unfortunately not able to be with us. You may have a reason, I don't, but...
She's in St. Petersburg talking about oil.
Okay, so better venue, I guess, perhaps. Anyway. So I think I'll shut up now and really begin to crack. So lastly, let me just remind you, because Patsy always tells me I forget this, to turn off your cell phones and turn off the music. We got music? You don't like the music? We were going to give you music. We got music? This is a first. All right, we'll turn the music off. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, please turn off your cell phones and join me in welcoming our three speakers today.
Click that on for me.
Okay. You're going to have to hand this around.
I know.
my role is to just kick this off. Yes?
The microphone's not working.
The microphone's not working. Oh, it's good.
Now?
Is that better?
No.
Are you picking that up on the audio?
Yeah.
Okay. Now? Okay, then just make. You'll have to shout.
I'm going to shout. For those of you who are like me, a bit hard of hearing, I'll try to shout even louder. Frontiers of science. You know, usually when we think of how we get to a frontier of science, think of people sitting in a lab and maybe saying eureka, or maybe saying that's funny, and moving on to some new level of discovery. Or the other way is to wake up and find that we have a huge oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, and we don't know much about it. We don't know much about what's happening. We don't know much about the ecosystems that are involved. And we find that we're on a frontier of science. What we're going to try to do today is to illustrate how we might begin to move that frontier a bit down the road, and what the small part, but important part, that FAU is playing in it. I want to say that what we're going to cover today is really a very small part of FAU's total science capacity and its role in the oil spill, but it's probably one of the most scenic and certainly the most fascinating. So I'm going to start. Dennis Hanisak is going to follow up, and Tammy is going to follow Dennis, and we're going to move as smoothly through as we can, and then at the end have some questions and comments, and later refreshments. What I wanted to do right at the beginning is to say that the Gulf of Mexico is messed up anyway. It really is one of the world's most impacted ecosystems. This is just a map of the annual dead zone that comes around the Gulf of Mexico every year. Nothing to do with oil, but it's to do with the pollutants from the Mississippi River and from all the agriculture in the middle of America. We enjoy the food. We don't really take care of the effluents. They all come down the Mississippi. They end up in the Mississippi Delta. And we have the dead zone, which is really a zone for all kinds of reasons where oxygen is zero. Fish die or they avoid it. So that's the start, Gulf of Mexico. Parts of it are not fun to start with. You can't see much of this, except all those blue lines are lines to do with the petroleum industry. So on top of the dead zone and the yes?
Could we possibly dim the lights and then we could see the slide better?
Yep.
It's either all off, but then they can't.
No. No, we're in a problem.
Turn them off.
Catch 22. That's better. Okay. Thank you. So what this shows is that the oil industry in all of its, the oil and gas industry in all of its various components already covers a large part of the western part of the Gulf of Mexico. And there are routine oil spills, small in number, but they do add up, if we look at them all, to a major impact on the environment. So a lot of things are going on. Then this. Suddenly we have a breakdown, as we know, in the management of this oil well. As we're learning in the last few days, there's not one guilty person, but a number of sequential events that led to this, the biggest environmental disaster that the US has experienced. The impact, we were lucky. We were very fortunate. Not we in Florida. The whole Gulf was fortunate that up to this point it wasn't a lot worse than it is. But a large area shown on the map was impacted, and we were all very, very nervous about how near to Florida would it get and what the impacts on Florida would be. We had almost 5 million barrels of oil spilt. That's over 200 million gallons. And if you think of the Valdez oil spill, which was the previous big disaster, look at the difference. It's 1/10 of that in terms of quantity. It ranged from, despite all the different estimates, from 50 to 60 some thousand barrels a day. On top of that, we threw a lot of dispersants in to help not clean up the oil, but to help put it into a different form which could be more easily dealt with. So all that stuff was going into the Gulf, and so far the impacts, to clean up the impacts, a modest estimate of the direct costs are $40 billion. Of course, in relation to a war or two, that's not much, but it really is a huge, huge sum, and those $1 billion aren't really the cost. The costs are in people's lives, the costs are in the ecosystems degradation, the costs are going to be with us for a long period of time. So what does a university do in response to something like this? And our former president, Frank Brogan, who is now chancellor of the university system, really did some smart things. He immediately formed a statewide task force of representatives of all of the universities and said, okay, you guys get on the phone as often as you want, meet as often as you want, begin to plan university-wide, whole Florida-wide response to this, particularly in general, but in particularly as it gets near the Florida shores. We need to build our knowledge, we need to build our defenses. And that's when we found that this was a real frontier of science. We didn't know a lot about the Gulf marine ecosystems. In fact, we could say that despite all of our science, we knew relatively little, particularly about the deep water ecosystems and particularly about some of the dynamics of the midwater. And as Dennis and Tamara will tell you later, this oil spill is different. It isn't a ship spilling oil at the top, it's a well gushing oil from the bottom. And much of the impacts were not just on the surface, they were through the whole range of the 5,000 feet, 1 mile of water between the oil spill and the top. And how that worked and how that is continuing to work, we still don't know the full story. What did FAU do in part of this? Well, we were fortunate enough to have the Harbor Branch, and Harbor Branch had the Stuart Johnson research vessel, and that was almost immediately put at the disposal of NOAA, and there was a baseline survey of, which we'll talk about in a lot more detail, of part of the Gulf, the eastern part of the Gulf, to begin to draw a baseline of what might happen if the oil got there. And that was a very important piece. BP made $10 million almost quite soon available for university research, and FAU produced 31 proposals, and we could produce 131, given a little more time. But what was interesting is that those proposals in response went from the School of Business, Harbor Branch, College of Science, College of Engineering, right across the university. It needs the whole range of science and social science expertise to deal with this kind of problem. And we were awarded a relatively small amount of money, but BP has promised over the next 10 years $500 million of research money. That will not be enough, but it will get us started on understanding what the impacts are and what the impacts have been. And for the fun part, I'm going to turn you over to Dennis.
Don't need that.
Oh, you don't need. Fine. No.
Thank Dr. Berry. He does a lot of things at the university, and
No, the mic doesn't work.
Doesn't work.
Yes, it does.
Oh, it does? Oh, okay. All right. Sorry. Here you go. Just get up here. And I was shouting. All right.
Turn it down. Okay, so just an abbreviated thank you again for y'all coming, and also to Dr. Berry. I had a good opportunity the last couple of years to really get to know him a lot more, and he facilitates a lot of collaborative research at the university. So you're just seeing a tiny portion of that. So Len, thank you for having us come. And I want to also point out in terms of collaboration that while it's just me and Dr. Tammy Frank here, that there's more than 40 scientists from more than 10 universities and agencies work together on this one project that Dr. Berry mentioned, our expedition to the Gulf this summer. This was a picture taken near the end of our trip back at the dock. Not everybody that was at sea was in the picture. But it's really important to realize that all science, when you're studying that frontier, it's really a big collaboration, especially when you're studying that ocean frontier that we know so little bit about. So really, we're here to represent about 40 other people that couldn't quite make it because there wasn't going to be enough seats. No. Okay, so let's see if this works. Briefly, I have to give you some background about another opportunity we had that set the stage for how we were able to respond so quickly to this oil spill. And that's this NOAA Cooperative Institute. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the trip itself. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the main focus, the benthic focus, which was about something called mesophotic reefs, or deep water reefs. And Dr. Tammy Frank's going to talk about her specialization, which is on zooplankton, but also how what's in the water column ties into those important benthic reef resources. And we're also going to talk about how, especially now that Harbor Branch is part of the university since the last day of 2007, we have a strong involvement with teaching of students, especially graduate students. And Tammy and I, as part of our work, we had an at-sea experience for graduate students, and she's going to tell you about that. Basically, very briefly, we, through a competitive funding process, were able to get an award from NOAA for a 5-year center called the Cooperative Institute for Ocean Exploration, Research, and Technology. And it is led by Dr. Shirley Pomponi, who had hoped to be here today, but as mentioned, she's over in St. Petersburg, meeting with all the other universities as well, talking about the oil spill and talking about the next phase of research opportunities. So that's why she's not here today. We share the responsibility of managing that Cooperative Institute with the University of North Carolina in Wilmington. And we also have 2 key partners as well, the University of Miami, most of you know, not too far to the south, and SRI International, which is actually located in St. Petersburg. And they're known for their innovation in technology, among other things. Our overall mission is to develop tools or new technologies for studying that ocean frontier that we talked about. It's a lot harder to work in the sea. I mean, BP found that out, right, when they tried to cap it. It's much easier to cap an oil spill, on land. Same situation. Everything we do in the ocean is much, much harder than it is to do on shore. So a big part of what we're trying to do is to make more tools available for everyone to study the ocean. And we want to do explorations. We want to do ocean explorations, and we want to study things from natural environments to cultural resources. And I'll give you some examples later. One of our real important focuses, and one of the reasons why I think we were competitive to receive this Cooperative Institute, is the emphasis is on coral reef systems. Both shallow ones, maybe the ones like in the Florida Keys, but also maybe some deep water ones. Maybe you've never seen images before. I'll show you some of them coming up. But that's a really important part of what we're supposed to study, and we have a lot of good skill here at FAU on coral reef studies. And lastly, we need to have an education component, including outreach. And outreach is things like what we're doing today. We're telling you about the research of the scientists, and I've already alluded to the fact that we also had a formal education or a graduate student component that Dr. Tammy Frank will tell you about. So when we look at shelf resources, we're talking about things like this Lophilia coral, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that might be down 2,000 feet. But it's an important nursery for things like all kinds of fisheries, including here you can see a picture of the golden crab. Another example is grouper. A lot of the major fisheries around the state of Florida are dependent upon coral reef systems. This is also something I'm only going to mention very briefly later, an opportunity for biomedical work. I saw Ram here right there, and he knows all about all the biotech opportunities that are possible in the ocean. And we have a group at Harbor Branch that studies this very heavily, and there's also some groups here in Boca as well. And also there's some interest in submerged cultural resources, so shipwrecks, you know, things like the Spanish galleons, for example. One of the things that we look for is also hazards and threats to this ocean frontier. And this can be things, and you'll see some more pictures later, abandoned fishing gear or destructive harvesting of fish, where basically the whole coral reef is destroyed by trawlers instead of just taking the fish. Things like diseases. Len already mentioned the pollution like from the Mississippi River. Climate change, which he also leads our efforts here at FAU. That's an increasingly important item that all of us in the marine environment are studying. And we always have to consider long-term impacts versus short-term incidents. Probably this oil spill is probably one that is not really short-term. There were some short-term components, but there's also going to be some very long-term impacts as a result of that. We're very interested in how do we manage the ocean and how do we mitigate damages, such as what we've seen with this oil spill. Very briefly, we are over here somewhere. Harbor Branch is up here at Fort Pierce. We actually had a plan for a cruise that was going to happen next May. And we were going to go around and explore this whole edge of the continental shelf around Florida, specifically looking at these vulnerable coral reefs and looking at things like who's there, why does it matter, why is it important, how does it impact fisheries. And Tammy, for example, was going to be looking at how does that tie into the plankton in the water column and so on. So we already had a plan in place. The oil spill came along over here. And you may remember around May last year, you read the newspapers like I did, it sounded like that oil was going to come all around Florida, was going to come all along our coast, was going to impact the coral reef and the Keys. The state was scurrying to do all kinds of pre-impact assessments. And we said, well, the best thing that we could do is we already have money to do a plan. Let's just modify it and go out and see if we can determine, hopefully, just pre-impact, maybe never any impacted areas of the coral reef system. And at the time, we had no idea where the oil was going to end up. Okay? So that's what we did. We wanted to do baseline assessments. We wanted to look at impacts of oil and also the dispersant. You probably read about the dispersant being potentially as bad as the oil itself. We wanted to document any subsurface oil plumes, accumulations of oil, and we wanted to also do our education and outreach. Our main research tool, Len has already mentioned, the research vessel Seward Johnson. This is one of our submersibles, the Johnson Sea Link 2. Happy to tell you more about that a little later. We also did more traditional oceanography over the side, such as CTD, which stands for conductivity, temperature, and depth. And we have all these water sampling bottles, so we can get water samples, possibly looking for traces of oil throughout the entire water column. Tammy will talk in depth about some of her plankton nets, and particularly this one called the mock ness. So she'll cover that a little bit more. We had collaboration, as I said, from a lot of other institutions. We had somebody on board for the first part of the cruise from USF, the University of South Florida, who was specifically taking the water samples here and going through a very rigorous procedure to save the samples for extraction for presence of oil. I want to very quickly seg into the exploration we did on the coral reefs. This part of the project was led by John Reed. John is actually a graduate of FAU. He got his master's here in the 70s, and he's been at Harbor Branch ever since. And he truly is a treasure and is known throughout the world as one of the best deep water coral biologists anywhere. So again, I speak for a lot of other people besides just me today. Very briefly, we were looking again around the shelf, and the big fear was the loop current that operates out here most years is working in such a way that that would come along the continental shelf, impacting the coral reefs and the Keys, and maybe the reefs along this coast. So that was kind of the physical oceanography quick overview. This is an image from the satellites. This is that loop current again. You can see some oil up here. And these are actually little filaments of oil that were coming along this area that we were to study. So when we first started the expedition, there seemed to be a real possibility that we were going to see some significant oil impacts. I'll say in brief, so far we saw no real oil impacts, signs of oil itself in any of the chemical analysis anywhere on the cruise. That's a good thing. This just shows you again some of our dive sites. And I just want to show you briefly what one of these would look like. A lot of the information that we use to say, well, where might there be a reef? Where might there be an interesting spot? Has to do with AUVs, which is an autonomous underwater vehicle. Think of it as a submersible that's been programmed by a computer to go out and basically take a swath and map it. And this is something that FAU has considerable expertise, especially down at the CTEC campus. And this is just a quick image of this robot basically swimming along and programmed to get these depth profiles. And that's basically a sonar system. And we now have incredible capabilities to get very high resolution images. And we basically looked at those, analyzed those, and kind of picked some of our spots. So let me just say that one of the spots that always interests me is this area off the Tortugas, Pulley Ridge, and this is the Tortugas Preserve down there. And so let me just focus in on that. This is what one of those images looks like. And this is this feature called Pulley Ridge. It's a very narrow ridge, goes very like north to south. These are some of our dive areas. And it turns out there's some incredible organisms there, fish and corals that we studied. And here's another one, an area called Miller's Ridge. And you can kind of see there's deeper water here. This is a much shallower, like a plateau, an underwater plateau. So basically when you see changes in elevation like that, you're basically saying there's structure there. There's houses, houses for organisms there is the way I look at it. Okay? That's just a close-up. So this is a dive where we said, this is the Big Plateau. Boy, what's this interesting feature over here? And so we actually dropped the submersible here and kind of studied this whole area. And these are waypoints along the way. If we took a bathymetry tracing from the boat, from the ship, this is what we would see in that last area. This is that plateau. This is kind of like that valley. And here you see kind of this interesting structure here, which oftentimes is a sign of coral and or high fish densities. Okay, the video. Let's see if this works. Odds are it will. I wanted to show you a quick, because most of you have never been down the submersible, I gather. And I just want to show you what it looks like. So this, you're sitting in the front of the submersible. It's a sphere. It's kind of like instead of you looking at an aquarium, watching the fish, you're kind of in the fishbowl and everything is around you. And you see these reefs, which again, you see a lot of the structure. Those nooks and crannies are all important for different organisms to live in. And we see these interesting pillars, which is like almost a whole nother story for another time. So that's just a really quick shot. In the interest of time, I'm going to stop it there. But we have another one. We have a better one. Okay. So, yeah, let's just say now, I think to me, the day that we had the biggest discovery started just like looking at those kinds of images from the surface of the ship. And we were at an area off of Naples. This is Naples over here. We were right on the shelf edge over here. And we found that morning, this is the bathymetry tracing, we found this structure here. And John Reed and myself and a third person that was on doing the work said, that looks really cool. We've never been there. Let's go and see what's there. And it turned out that this was an entire new reef system called Lophilia. It's known from other parts of the world. It's known from other parts of the Gulf. It's the most easternmost reef of Lophilia in the Gulf, previously unknown. It's spectacular. It's the largest one that John Reed has seen in his 30-some years of work. So this is Lophilia, one of the crabs that are very plentiful there, some of the fish. And Lophilia is known really throughout the world. It's a very important deep water coral. And this is the second video coming up. And it worked right away. And this actually had some music to it. The music was classical gas. So if you all know that, you can hum along. Okay, this again just gives you a sense of what it's like to be down there. It's not really quite the same. But as far as you can see, there's this coral. Most of it is live. The lighter stuff is live coral. Now, you think of coral reef in the Keys, for example, normally being golden brown, and that's because it has photosynthetic organisms in it, little algae called zooxanthellae that have that golden brown color. These have no color because it's too deep for light for photosynthesis. So these are the polyps, and they basically feed like an animal, and they feed on some of the organisms that Tammy will be talking to you about briefly. They're very rich in all kinds of invertebrates, many species that are previously unknown, high biodiversities. These are like the oasis out in the Gulf. Okay, so if most of the bottom is sandy or sediment or muddy, you find these structures, and that's where everything is live, very active. This information on the top, by the way, is what we typically see when we're diving. It will tell us and record for us what the temperature is, what the salinity is, what the depth is. Those two dots, if you can see them, are laser beams that are 10 centimeters apart. So you can get an estimate of size of a fish, okay? And we usually record that for future work. So again, this is just a very brief look at what is out there. John has documented, you take a certain meter square of reef, and there's thousands of little invertebrates, most of them that you would not be able to see here on these images. And again, very rich for fish habitats. A lot of these areas now are being preserved because they're so important to the fisheries. Okay, I'm just about done with my session, but I want to mention very briefly that some of the other work that we're doing involved biologists Joshua Voss and Sarah Edge. They're using newer molecular tools to look at stress. So say, for example, you get a little bit of an oil spill, or maybe you get the dispersant. Most of the time in the past, we've said, oh, the coral's alive, the coral's dead. We're much more interested now in knowing, is it being stressed? Is there a physiological impact? Maybe early signs of that are very important. So they developed this for other environmental stresses besides oil. So this is the first time we've applied that idea to these organisms. And as mentioned, Sarah Edge was one of the people who got the funding to do work for FAU for 2 years. We also are doing drug discovery. This is Dr. Amy Wright, and she is associated with the chemistry department down here as well. And in particularly, she came out only for the last week. She came out because in the first leg, we could not find this one organism that she's been looking for again for years. She said, I'm going to have to come down and find it myself. And so I said, Amy, you can come down. You can do the dives all day long. You can get it. And I'm not going to show you the video, just to say she was very successful. These are very small, like maybe the size of my thumb, sea cucumbers. But they're very special. They have some very special chemistry that is being used for a number of projects at the Harbor Branch, including the search for a drug that might help fight pancreatic cancer, which, as you know, is a very nasty disease with very little chemicals that we have on our side. We actually have this alive and living still since the cruise, and we feed them. Segging seamlessly to Dr. Tammy Frank. Tammy's been at Harbor Branch about 20 years, and her expertise is zooplankton, and she led the project that she's going to talk about now.
Thank you, Dennis. In order for you to understand the effects of oil on zooplankton, which are drifters, animals that cannot swim against currents, I want to give you a little bit more background on the oil spill and why it's different from other oil spills. As Dr. Berry already told us, it's the biggest peacetime spill ever. The most important thing is this one started deep. The other ones that we're used to reading about started when a ship wrecked and the oil started in the surface. This one started deep, down in 5,000 feet of water. And in addition, in the Gulf of Mexico, we have the added complexity of the loop current, which both Dr. Hanisak and Dr. Berry have ever told you about. But the problem with the loop current is that it gets close to the oil, it spills off these little eddies that can carry oil to other regions. Now, during the spill, there was substantial use of dispersants. And the liberal use of these toxic dispersants caused the oil on the surface to break up into smaller invisible particles. So the idea being out of sight, out of mind. Now, the National Research Council has said that dispersants do not actually reduce the total amount of oil in the water. They simply change the chemical and physical properties of the oil. The objectives behind using a dispersant is that it enhances the amount of oil that mixes into the water column, reducing the potential that a surface slick will contaminate shoreline habitats. So when used correctly in the proper environment, dispersants can be beneficial. They can reduce the impacts of an oil spill, such as in Alaska. We still had large amounts of oil hitting the shoreline, but not nearly as much as if they hadn't used dispersants. But used improperly in the wrong environment, the damage from then the dispersants can lead to the formation of mousses. And these are these thick clumps of oils that washed up on the beaches in Louisiana. The recommended volume of dispersant used properly is to use 1 part dispersant per 10 gallons of oil. Well, during this spill, scientists estimated that they used 1 part dispersant per 1,000 gallons. So what this did is that rather than getting rid of the oil, it kind of mixed it into the water column. The result were these thick, glutinous mousses that washed up on the shore. The other problem is dispersants are toxic, and some of the studies have shown that the combination of oil and dispersant is actually more toxic than just oil alone or just dispersant alone. Now, this is where the problem with the zooplankton gets to be important. Eggs and larvae are considered zooplankton. They're animal drifters. They cannot swim. They cannot move out of the water. They also have a very large surface to volume ratio. What this means is they have a very large surface area through which these toxic dispersants and oils can diffuse into the body, and they have a relatively very small volume through which to spread this dispersant out and kind of reduce the effects. So large surface area, a lot of the stuff can get into the body, not much body tissue to kind of spread it out. So it's going to be very concentrated. There are also lethal effects, meaning it kills the eggs and larvae, but there's also sublethal effects that don't become evident for a while. And studies have shown that while the eggs and larvae might survive exposure to the oils and the dispersants, the juveniles that result from these eggs and larvae might have serious behavioral problems. They don't respond properly to predators, their reproductive behavior isn't correct, their feeding behavior isn't correct, and what this means is then the adult populations are going to be dramatically affected. So due to the vulnerability of eggs and larvae to oil and dispersants, it's possible that the most dramatic effects of the New Horizon oil spill haven't been seen yet. There are several reasons to believe this may be true. Hopefully it's not. But we know that adult fish can detect petroleum at very low concentrations and swim away. So large numbers of dead fish have rarely been reported after oil spills. However, all the commercially important fisheries in the Gulf of Mexico have eggs and larvae that are part of the plankton. So if the plankton were seriously affected by the oil, we're going to see the effects on the adult populations in several years. So all of these fisheries have very vulnerable planktonic eggs and larvae. And perhaps the most critical one is the bluefin tuna. Its spawning grounds were up in the region of the oil spill, and it spawns from May to June. So we'll just have to keep monitoring the populations and see if there is actually a significant effect of this oil spill. So as I said, the impacts from the effects on the eggs and larvae won't be visible for several years. There is some anecdotal data from the Exxon Valdez suggesting that the impacts on eggs and larvae can have a dramatic effect on the adult populations. And it was shown in laboratory studies that Pacific herring eggs that were exposed to the Exxon Valdez oil have a very high susceptibility to this lethal virus. In 1993, 4 years after the spill, there was a collapse of the Pacific herring stock. Now, the problem here is that there weren't any baseline assessments of the eggs and larvae, and there weren't any assessments of the eggs and larvae after the spill. So we don't have a real cause and effect. We have a correlation, but there's a lot of things that can lead to the collapse of a fishery, more than just the effects on the eggs and larvae. That's why baseline assessments before oil hits is so important. You do the baseline assessment, and then you have something to compare later monitoring studies against and determine if one of our fisheries crashes, is it due to the effects on the oil or larvae, or are they not related? So, with respect to the New Horizon oil spill, there was a huge plume of oil, 22 miles long, more than 3,000 feet below the surface, that was slowly rising towards the surface. So the question is, how were the eggs and larvae impacted by this? Are we going to see effects on the eggs and larvae populations once we do the post-impact assessments? And later on, are we actually going to see effects on our fisheries? So as I said, these pre-impact assessments are critical for obtaining baseline information so you have something to compare against, so you can actually really determine whether or not there is a cause or effect. So we had the CIOERT cruise that Dennis talked about, funded by NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. And it was funded by NOAA. We had strong support from FAU as well as the Cooperative Institute. And for this part of the study, this was done on legs 3 and 4 of the cruise. So we got on the ship here and went all the way around here and did our zooplankton assessments. The objectives were, as I said, to get a baseline, to get some number against which to compare monitoring studies in later years to determine whether or not there is an effect. And education was a strong part of this. We have to get our young budding scientists out there learning how to do these techniques. So Dennis and I taught a graduate level course, and we had 7 graduate students from FAU participate on the 4th leg of the cruise. The tools we used were the RV Seward Johnson and the Johnson Sealing Submersible. Now you might ask, well, it's a submersible. Plankton is microscopic. How can you use a submersible to study plankton? Well, for one thing, if there is an oil spill, it's only going to have a significant effect on animals that live on the bottom, which also have eggs and larvae that are found in the water column, if they happen to be spawning at that time. If they're not spawning, the effects in their water column are going to be substantially less. We don't know when most of these organisms are spawning. We can collect them alive with the Johnson Sea Link, bring them up in a refrigerated chamber, and then do histological studies on them to determine, are they spawning at this time of year? Hopefully the answer will be no. But what we also need to know is maybe they've already spawned. Maybe they've already released their eggs and sperm into the water column and there's larvae starting to swim around. Well, with our nets, we cannot get close to the reef. It's too much danger of impacting that reef. We have to keep the nets at least 50 feet above the reefs. So with the Johnson Sea Link submersible, we can collect water samples in a suction tube into different chambers and determine whether or not there are eggs and larvae near the bottom. Above the bottom, we use a net called the Multiple Opening Closing Net Environmental Sensing System, or for short, MOCNES. And this is a net that belongs to the University of Miami group, and the 2 technicians on the cruise were Don Cucchiera and Chip Maxwell, who really kept this incredibly complicated piece of equipment running beautifully. What's unique about this net is that it has 8 separate nets on it, and they can be open and closed sequentially. So rather than dropping a net in the water and towing at one depth, bringing it back up, emptying it out, dropping it again, and doing repeated deployments, you can sample 8 different depths at the same time. In addition, the net also has sensors for real-time depth to let us know what depth we're taking these samples from. It also measures temperature, salinity, oxygen, and fluorescence so that we can correlate the distribution of animals, the distribution of plankton, with these environmental factors as well. So the students were absolutely invaluable in deploying this net. They were taught all aspects of it, from rigging the net up. You have to rig it up so that each net will deploy separately, launching the net, as well as when the net came back up. Each of the containers at the end of the net had to be separately emptied into buckets, filtered with filtered seawater, filtered in the lab through sieves because we didn't want to bring 102 buckets of seawater back with us, and then later sampling and assessing the zooplankton both on shipboard and then mostly back in the lab. The students also participated in rigging and launching the CTD, the water collector. They each had a dive in the back of the Johnson Sea Link submersible so they could see for themselves what the bottom habitat looked like. They participated in receiving and storing the specimens once they came up, and then they helped the scientists with their various research projects. So, baseline assessments, we looked at larvae. As I said, the larvae are the most sensitive to the effects of the oil and the dispersants, and this includes fish larvae. And note that these are photographed under a microscope. These are pretty much close to microscopic. They're about a millimeter to 2 millimeters long. We also looked at crustacean larvae. That on the left is a stomatopod. This is what a shrimp larvae looks like. This is what a crab larvae looks like. And this is what our lobster larvae look like. Fortunately for us, other people have already identified what adult species these larvae come from because they look nothing like the adults. We also, in addition to the larvae, looked at ostracods, which are these kind of very odd-shaped crustaceans, also called clam shrimp, as well as copepods. And the reason we look at these is that these are major food sources for the larvae of the juveniles and for the larvae and juveniles of commercially important fish and shrimp. So not only are we looking at the larval stages, but we're also looking at the food of the larval stages because these are also small zooplankton, equally susceptible to the effects of the oil and the dispersants. So the students completed various research projects on our samples, so we very cleverly had them do part of our work for us by having them assess actually I think it was a total of 333 samples that we brought back to the lab. They were taught how to do presentation quality posters. And just as an interesting note, some of the preliminary results from these student projects, and certainly were not finished, they weren't able to do all the samples in a single semester, but what they discovered is that there's a much higher density of fish and crab larvae at the Madison-Swanson location than at the Pulley Ridge location. Madison-Swanson is a fishery reserve. So it looks like the fishery reserves are doing what they're supposed to do and increase the populations of the fisheries that are found at these reserves. So this work could not have been done without the very capable efforts of the captain and crew of the RV Stewart Johnson, as well as the pilots and crew of the Johnson Sea Link submersibles. If you want more information about this cruise and what went on, you can Google the words FLOSI. In addition, if you are interested, we have this slide on a handout in the back there. There are daily logs from what went on in the cruise. There's a lot of pictures. And the results that we got from this cruise as we analyze the data will also be posted on these web pages. And with that, I'll leave the rest up to Lynn.
Put it on for me. Of course, and I won't take long, so you can ask some questions. There are many lessons for the future, we learn more every day. The ones I picked out is that we really need this baseline work. Sometimes in the past, money has been withdrawn from baseline work because they say, well, what's the purpose of it? A lot of wisdom now is put into saying we need better understanding of the way these ecosystems work, the way the food chain works, and so on, not for theoretical science, but for practical purposes. And there is a really good trend right now, apart from the oil spill, at looking at the ocean in similar ways that we look at the land. And we're saying, how do we create zones in the ocean which are to be protected? How do we create zones in the ocean which can be utilized for various purposes, and what are those purposes, and how do we cut down the environmental impact of those uses? And so managing ocean ecosystems is going to be a thing that the world is going to have to deal with, because quite apart from the oil spill, our ocean resources are one of the major resources of the world, and they are not being used very wisely at the moment. We need to manage risk assessment much better. I think that the people who are involved in the management of that oil facility were not worried so much about risk as about profit. And I'm not against profit, but the profit has to be managed in a way that's not going to cost downstream terrible losses to both the company and to other people. And the other thing that we found in a very practical way, and this is not our finding, this is the finding of the people that were managing the oil spill, both on the practical side and on the scientific side, is that we don't have good coordination mechanisms for dealing with these local happenings. The local folk want to be in charge. The federal people think they have a role. Scientists want their piece. And who's in charge is a really important factor. And how we begin to think about response mechanisms in a management sense is as important as how we think about response mechanisms in a scientific sense. So there's a few more websites for you that I'm sure you're eager to get hold of and write down. But the Center for Environmental Studies has a whole set of websites. The most important one, and this one, is the oilspill.fsu.edu. That's the state oil spill website, which we all contribute to. And in relation to this talk, that's something that is continuously updated, or continually, not continuously, updated, and which is a continuing source of information. I want to thank my two colleagues. I was as interested as you were, and if there are any questions, let's have them now. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Question. How many years would have to pass after an oil spill before you would say an observed effect is not related to the oil spill?
That's a good question, and right now we don't know. We don't have enough baseline assessments. So with the money that BP is putting into this, hopefully we'll be able to answer that question in about 10 years.
But we do know that the Valdez oil spill is still having impacts that are significant. Yeah. And that is now 12 years?
20.
20 years. Yeah.
What was the effect of the delay in skimming, and was there a delay in the skimming of the oil after the initial accident?
I honestly don't know the answer to that. There certainly was, talking about my last point, management, certainly was confusion and disjointed responses, and that included skimming. But that was part of the issue. Was the local parish representative wanted to be in charge, and they felt they knew what to do. The BP wanted a role, and until that was sorted out, I'm sure a lot of things that should have been done weren't being done. Dennis?
even worse cases in the Persian Gulf or something.
That oil spill happened off the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico in, I think, 1979, so late 70s. And it's a very remote area. And even probably more so than here, there was really very little baseline data. So there's some local impacts known. But unfortunately, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, that would be a much better model to look at. But if you look at it, there's actually very little data that seem to be directly applicable. But Bill Lauda knows a lot about this because he used to work for the petroleum companies. Want the mic?
The moose, they evaluated the mixture of the extract oil with water, and it becomes water washed and further degraded. They get up on the Padre Island on the shore. So there should be some data from the University of Texas.
And I don't think they used anywhere near the amount of dispersants.
The amounts are not that much.
Question behind?
Yeah. I'd like to make a comment. I knew about the catastrophe, and it looked as though it was impossible to solve, but I am so impressed with your efforts, your scientific knowledge, and what you've done. I'm kind of new to the area, only been here for about 10 years, and I believe your program is so outstanding. It is incredible. You as scientists, I learned more today in a few minutes about the creative frontier of the ocean. You should be applauded. And thank you.
Thank you very much.
I want to ask a question about what's the impact on legislation of your information?
Well, that's probably in your area, I would guess.
Our information is a small piece of the impact on legislation. I think that coming out of this, there was a greater impetus in the White House to really look at ocean management, and there was a committee that was formed before that, and that committee is reporting, and there's I can't remember the title of the report, but it came out about 2 months ago, and the whole understanding that we know much less than we should know was greatly helped by the studies that were done in the Gulf. But it wasn't just FAU, there were a number of other universities involved, and Louisiana people as well.
Can I say something?
Yeah, sure.
This is a little outside my bailiwick, but one thing I noticed is that our former governor, who just stepped down, he changed his opinion pretty quickly on offshore drilling. And if you look, also a lot of other politicians did about how we should handle drilling in our waters in Florida. But also, if you look at the public opinion polls, when gas was $4 a gallon, everybody said, let's go do more offshore drilling in Florida. This happened, and very quickly the public opinion polls swayed. So I think besides legislation, never forget the power you have as the public, in your opinion, because ultimately, you make the decision as to who's going to make the laws. So I think it's important to stay on top of this, and especially now that fuel prices are going back up again. I don't know if you've noticed, but it's going to go up very high again in the next few months. So we're going to have this clash between the need for more oil versus possible problems. I think Len says it best when you talk about management, crisis management.
Yeah, thanks.
Are oceanographic studies of this nature taking place other places in the world? And if so, are you in coordination or cooperation with any of them?
Tammy, you want to try that? And I'll tell you. I'll follow up.
Yeah, other countries are doing oceanographic studies, and I think there's Reef off of Norway, which they've been studying for years. They've actually had better funding to do these studies over the years than we have. So I think now there's going to be a strong impetus to do baseline studies.
Well, is there any impetus to have international cooperative research?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
definitely.
In fact, I had a conversation yesterday, believe it or not. I had too many conversations. But I had a conversation yesterday about, we have a new executive director coming into Harbor Branch, and we're already working with Brazil on parallel studies off Brazil. We're planning to work with Australia because, you know, one of the great unknown reefs in the world is the barrier reef. The Australians haven't done a lot of work on monitoring that. So there are prospects for FAU to be involved in a global enterprise.
Who's taking the lead in this effort?
I have to tell you, we are. Well, that's a bit exaggeration. Yeah.
Technology and drilling and tapping as far as improving the techniques so that we wouldn't have any spills?
The technology is, to the best of my understanding, it's not my field, is really quite good. It's the management of the technology that's the problem. And there was a wonderful cartoon. There were lots of good cartoons that came out of this thing, but there was a wonderful cartoon that said all exploration and drilling technology, and it had the rig with all the fancy bells and whistles, and they said oil cleanup technology, and they had a paper towel. I think we need both technologies, and the one that's really lagging is the cleanup technology.
Can I say something?
Yeah, sure.
Actually, if you watch the news reports on the spill, the technology was there. The procedures were there. They just weren't followed. They got sloppy. They did things too fast. They didn't wait long enough. So I think really what has to be done is better oversight.
People have been told that it's safe to eat the seafood from the oil spill. From what you're telling me in a preliminary manner, we really don't know, do we?
That's your question.
I eat seafood. I would say I don't have any problems with it. The ones that are impacted by these chemicals, they're going to show behavioral abnormalities. I mean, if the scientists do the chemical analyses of the seafood and say there is no oil or dispersants in them, I think you can believe them, as long as it's not scientists hired and paid by the oil companies. It is a problem because bacteria suck down oxygen. And so you have a lot of bacterial activity occurring, you get oxygen dead zones, which are just as difficult a problem to deal with. So yeah, the monitoring studies have to continue to determine whether or not there's now dead zones where those bacteria were operating. Now that brings up a point. A lot of the early solutions were, well, let's just seed the oil with bacteria, seed the location with artificial bacteria to eat up the oil. But as we've seen, Mother Nature seems to take care of her own.
Do you think that the federal government was an impediment to the cleanup with technology that was available worldwide?
I work for the state government, I guess, in the university. The federal government was most at fault, in my opinion, with the Minerals Management Service and its oversight role. And as you read from the newspaper, and the people have changed now, but they were not exercising a proper oversight role. So it's not the technology that was so much a problem in my understanding, but that, you know, some people don't like regulation, but if we have regulation, then it's the duty of the regulators to monitor it and look after it. And if better regulation had occurred, it's possible this oil spill might not have happened.
Is there any way of helping these dead zones and bringing them back to life?
No, really.
Let nature take its course. What? Let nature take its course.
The dead zones are mostly, the one in the Gulf is mostly a result of many, many activities along the Mississippi River and all of its tributaries. It's the whole center of the country. So all the agricultural, all the industrial waste, they all end up going out to the ocean. So the answer is yes, it can be reversed. It takes a long time, and it takes every person and every industry and every little community doing better in terms of managing their waste. You know, I think somebody mentioned, well, not quite, one of the lines we always have is the solution to pollution is dilution, which means if, your waste, most communities grew up along the water, and most industries used to just dump all the waste and it went downstream and impacted somebody else, but it didn't impact you because it was gone, right? And people thought about the ocean that way too for a long time. You read things 30 years ago, people said we can never pollute the ocean to the extent that we have now. People just didn't realize that our individual activities, they add up so much. So it starts at the very individual level and the community level. So yes, it can be reversed. It's going to take a long time. That's my opinion.
One more question.
Where is it now? What's going to happen?
Oh.
A lot of it might have gone deep and covered some of the deep reefs. So there's a couple of cruises out there now where they're using a lander and little submersibles to see. Nobody really knows where it went. Chances are it went on the bottom. If we're lucky, it went on muddy bottom where there isn't a lot of life. But right now they're mobilizing cruises to go out and study some of these deep reefs in that area, DeSoto Canyon, Viosca Knoll, to see if it's fallen on those reefs. So, and answer your question is, we don't really know.
There was one more question. Go on.
I have heard that these submersibles that you were using have been either sold or leased to an oil exploration company in Brazil. How is that going to affect your future work?
It's going to have a significant negative impact on our work. So right now, we are hoping to get the sub back, and it's going to take some money to refit the sub so it can be launched from a ship of opportunity rather than the Seward Johnson, which has been sold. But we're also looking for alternative tools, such as ROVs, remotely operated vehicles, because this kind of thing happens in science all the time, particularly in oceanography. If the tool you're used to using is no longer available, then you look for other ways to do the work.
And with that, ladies and gentlemen,
Well done. Yeah.